995 का brand.
Resume recording.
I've also planned for a couple of the questions that I think are likely to come up.
Okay, that's all good. Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing myself and then, well, actually, you're going to start by introducing you because that's the slide I put in first.
Oh, yeah.
My God, I might actually have to follow my own presentation. So shall I let you introduce yourself and the topic then?
Yes, I can do.
All right, hold on 1 second, then I'll just resume the slide share.
I always like doing these things on Zoom because you can see people like looking at their phones and not quite sure if they're on camera or not. But they've been hidden away now.
Just to make people aware that we are recording this with a view to it being a widely available resource. So if you would prefer not to be on screen or not be identifiable, you can change your name on there, or you can switch your cameras off so that you can't be seen. It's an important thing. So yeah, if you don't want to be seen, make yourself invisible. So, right. Alrighty. Ta-da-da! And then straight over to Tom.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tom Nicholson. I am currently a graduate tutor of mental health nursing at Northumbria University. What that means is I am responsible for the teaching of undergraduate mental health nurses, so I help nurses to become nurses. In that job, I'm also doing a PhD. So my PhD is focused on the ways in which parents experience the ADHD diagnostic journey. So what is it like being a parent on that journey, and how does it change? How does your story change over time? So I'm really interested in how those stories change and how we make those stories and who helps us make those stories. Prior to that, I was a mental health nurse in Newcastle and Gateshead SIPS service, where I was in the neurodevelopmental team, part of the assessment, diagnosis, treatment, and intervention for young people under 18 with ADHD and other neurodiverse differences or neurodevelopmental conditions, depending on language. And we'll probably get into that discussion on neurodiversity versus neurodevelopmental. I also speak on ADHD using a lot of my own personal experience, as I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 5 years old. And ADHD has kind of been the pivotal 4 letters of my life in either personal or professional capacity. So that's where I'm coming from. So I come with a multitude of hats, a clinical one, an academic one, and a personal one. And we'll probably end up diving in and out of all those different hats as the conversation goes on. And that's me in a brief nutshell.
And I'm Janine Harris, and I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult following the diagnosis of my children, which is actually quite a common thing. My eldest daughter was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when she was 8, and when she became an adult and I was looking at sort of needing some support with her, because you know, at some point she's got to be independent, right? And all those things. And I was like, this cannot be my responsibility forever. I will love her forever, but I can't take day-to-day responsibility like this forever. I need some help. So I approached adult services. I say she was 19 at that stage, and they added ADHD to her diagnosis, and I was a non-believing parent. So that means I will never judge anybody else for being non-believing, because that is where I started. And as is apparent, I had a wholesale change of heart and mind, because actually understanding Vicky through the lens of autism as well as ADHD, and that combination was what improved my relationship with her. And of course, treatment and strategies and stuff for ADHD made the whole world of difference to her. Then my son was diagnosed, then I was diagnosed, and then my other daughter was diagnosed after me. So, and then my stepson's also been diagnosed since. I'm a teacher. I trained specifically in SEN, and I left teaching at the beginning of 2019 to set up ADHD Wise as a training provider, and it became a coaching. I do an awful lot of coaching now, more coaching than anything else, because actually supporting on a one-to-one basis or on a family basis suits me down to the ground. I still love the getting out and training, and that is how I met Tom. We're both speakers at the last ADHD Foundation conference, but we met the previous one. Yeah. So, you know, thank you for ADHD Foundation for bringing us together. So we come at this from the same direction, Tom and I, but I like to think that because we've got sort of come at it slightly differently in some respects, hopefully we can put the two lots of experience together and give you a well-rounded presentation this evening. I also have Celia here today. Celia is one of my associate coaches. And she also has an organisation called Acorn to Oak Education, and she's also trying to start a school from scratch, you know, because people with ADHD can be very entrepreneurial and like to do lots and lots and lots of things. She's an amazing human being, and she will be managing the chat function, because as someone with ADHD, if I'm looking at the chat and trying to talk and listen to Tom, I won't manage it because my executive function won't let me. So Celia is my executive function for this evening.
As many parents need to become the executive functioning of their child, and that they need to do things differently to the average parent, which is proof of that in a nutshell. Sometimes our phones become our executive functioning for us, our calendars become our executive functioning, or our friends, our family, our spouses, our parents. We'll probably explain a bit more about what executive functioning is as we go through as well.
Absolutely. The first thing to say about receiving your ADHD diagnosis, from my point of view, is that lots of people come to me because they got the diagnosis and then they were kind of like sent on their way with not very much, with virtually no support or no support at all. Unfortunately, that happens a lot. It's not best practice, and it's not entirely the case, and I'm sure Tom can give you examples of where it works well, because it is possible to support families well. And this is a meme I wrote ages ago. If you need advice on how to raise a child with ADHD, ask someone without children with ADHD, because they've got all the answers. Clearly they haven't. So you do need to be able to approach adults. You can approach me, you can approach ADHD Foundation, you can approach Celia, you can approach Tom, and there are other organisations as well. If you're not getting the information from the services where you're expecting to get it, don't feel like you're on your own, because you're not. And I've also got Operation Diversity Academy on there, because I do a lot of work with them, and they have a wealth of experience on all kinds of SEN issues. And it's all relatively as cost effective as it possibly can be. As you will see down the bottom there, I've also got that I'm ADHD Wise is a registered social enterprise. That's the reason that we produce these videos, because actually it's about producing stuff for people because they need it, and that as much as this information should be as accessible as possible. I went off on a tangent then, really sorry. We're going to do that, aren't we, Tom?
We absolutely are, and sometimes it'll be really relevant and poignant, and other times it might not be so much, but still interesting. Someone has mentioned there, Richard, that my audio was a little bit woolly. It's because I'm hesitant to wear these massive headphones, just because it looks ridiculous when you're wearing a shirt. But
I can hear you really well, though.
You can hear us all right. I've just upped the volume slightly of my voice. My wife's listening in downstairs, okay. Rebecca, so she'll just hear us twice.
Oh, no. I don't want to hear you twice, Tom. So is there anything else you want to say about that, about the sort of so what now? What would you, in an ideal world, what would parents be experiencing when they first get that diagnosis? What information?
You know what, right? I'm going to I'm going to be wearing, as I say, two hats today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the research says, as I've been writing this section of my PhD this week. And I'm also going to talk about what the reality is for people. Now, the reality is an ADHD diagnosis for a lot of parents is a double-edged sword. It, in one way, alleviates and reduces blame and self-blame and shame of why is my child different? Why does my child find things difficult that other children their age don't? And ADHD, this diagnosis, can become a bit of an answer, not an excuse, but an answer, an understanding. But within that, the diagnosis can also come with stigmatization and discrimination, which, again, we talk a lot about what the media says about ADHD and about these narratives that are ongoing and have been ongoing. What I'm finding normally in the older generations, i.e. people over 50, where this argument is, well, ADHD didn't exist. Does it exist? It's not real because it wasn't there when I was a child. And I've got a real bugbear with that as a concept. And I'm going to go on a small diatribe here, I think, in that the concept of reality in mental ill health and psychiatric diagnoses generally is obscene, because the diagnoses have changed over time. As our understanding changes of the difficulties that people face, of biological components, of social influences on mental health, the diagnosis changes. You know, prior to the Vietnam War, no one was diagnosed with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The diagnosis was different. It was combat fatigue, battle stress, shell shock. And then we realized that actually PTSD, it's post-traumatic, it doesn't have to be war. So they changed the diagnostic criteria. The same thing happened with ADHD. Now, what the research actually says is that ADHD is a concept in the literature. It's been around since about 1902. There was a lad called Still who he described it as, now let's get this correct, it was minimal brain damage. That was it. Minimal brain damage or post-encephalitic brain damage. The symptoms of which were increased inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and a moral poor disposition in young boys. Now, as time has grown, these diagnoses change. So these labels change. So of course, no one had a diagnosis of ADHD in 1973, or very few people did, because of the label. That was not what was used. But our understanding has changed. And even just two years ago, in 2018, the International Classification of Diseases changed the diagnosis from hyperkinetic disorder to ADHD. So we can all agree now, the World Health Organization officially agrees that ADHD exists. Yeah, every single country with a psychiatric healthcare system agrees that ADHD exists in the form that is understood, which we'll probably talk about. So I want to get that out of the way really quickly about what is real or what is true, or because it's an uninteresting and unhelpful argument in understanding ADHD. I'll hold back from there.
Definitely one you could get on your soapbox, and you happen to mention 1973, which is when I was born, and you know, it is something that you are born with. Therefore, when I was born in 1973, I was born with it. So it definitely did exist. And also, if it could be disciplined out of a child, I wouldn't have it, because I was very heavily disciplined. I'm not disrespecting my parents, but I was quite heavily disciplined. They tried really hard to correct me. And in the end, I ended up in care, actually, because nobody really understood what was going on with me. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really, I think definitely my passion for this is very much that
Have we lost her there?
Known sooner about Vicky. I wish I'd known sooner about me. And there is a bit of a grief, I think, when you first get your ADHD diagnosis, whether it's as an adult or as a child or as an older child, for the things that could, would and should have been better if you had known sooner. I definitely went through that as a parent first. I looked back on Vicky's life and wish I had known. So the earlier you find out, the better. But, you know, the sooner you find it, once you've found out, okay, you can only move from there. So you do your best until you know better, and then you do better. But that's my big passion for it, because lots of negative outcomes come from the fact that it's not always recognised as, and we have an issue in the UK with being underdiagnosed and undermedicated, actually, whereas the media representation can be very different to that.
Absolutely, yeah, you're correct.
I put these two together, but I'm not sure that you would, Tom. So
no, there's two things I want to catch up on what you said there. One is about underdiagnosis in the UK. Every single epidemiological study that's been done in any country says that the rate of diagnosis should be around about 5% of school-age children fulfill the criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD, whereas in the UK we are only at 1.6% of diagnostic rate. So we massively underdiagnose in line with what the figures, what we should expect. And another thing you said there was grief. You mentioned grief at the time of diagnosis. And I think there's also an element, and I used to have this a lot when young children were diagnosed with autism, in that there's a experience of parental grief, that the child that you thought you were going to have is lost, and maybe your child is going to need more support than you expected, maybe older than you expected, for longer than you expected. Maybe they are going to have difficulties around relationships, around getting a job, around education, and those things, grieving about those things and that potential reality is a totally normal response to what is both in some ways a real positive. Being neurodiverse is amazing in some ways, but also a real challenge. And it's, I never want to lose that in these discussions. When we talk about ADHD as a superpower, I loved your thing on the BBC for ADHD is my superpower, and it can be, but it can also be your nemesis. It can also make life bloody hard.
it definitely does.
Yeah, I mean, I say can, it just does, actually. Yeah.
It's definitely harder, but that doesn't mean it can't be good. But it is definitely harder.
It's different as well. As we talk about the diagnostic criteria, I mean, Laura Coulthard and Laura at the time was an academic in Durham University, and she's now, she works in the council, in the SEN support for council. And we did a study, a systematic review looking at the positives of ADHD symptomology. Like, what are the positives around having ADHD?
Yeah.
And that's what we presented at the ADHD Foundation conference.
Yes. And that's why I adore you and your work, because that positivity is massively important, I think.
It is, and the thing that we found was that in the research, it wasn't just that there was very little there, it's that researchers weren't asking the question. It was always framed as, what are the hard parts? What are the problems? What problems does ADHD bring in your life? Very rarely was the question, what positives or boons does it bring? And that was our little call to arms, is to start using that narrative as well. And I think that's coming out more, especially with yourself and the ADHD Foundation, where we're looking at what are the positives for workforces, for family life. I mean, for one, it's never boring. I've seen a couple of the parents potentially nodding there. Your child is more interesting, for sure. Not many parents have conversations about volcanoes at 3 o'clock in the morning, but ADHD parents do.
I think it's important to recognise that ADHD is heterogenetic. It's a combination of genes and environment. But the environment can't cause ADHD unless ADHD was there in the first place. So you have a genetic. You're either genetically you're either disposed. You're either genetically disposed to it, or you're not. There's quite a lot of research on that. So, you know, parents need to go easy on themselves, and families and friends need to be more supportive, because it is brain based, and it's from birth. You can't cause ADHD, but you can mitigate it by having the best environment possible. But you know, it's heterogenetic. It is. I know you wanted to talk about the difference between neurodiversity and neurodevelopmental. So I'm kind of watching my words a little bit, because you might tell me something I don't know about all of that. So which is fab. But it's a brain-based condition, and behaviour is just the symptom. It's the top of the iceberg that we can see, and all this stuff is happening underneath. And our children aren't actually meaning to make life hard for us. So it's actually really important to recognise that, and to be forgiving of yourself, and also to be forgiving of your child, and to become as solution focused as you can, rather than thinking that you can stop ADHD, because you know what? If you could, it would have been done. But then people like me and Tom and Celia and lots of other people here, I would imagine, wouldn't exist, or wouldn't exist in the same way.
Yeah, I think it is important that you say that when we talk about cause as well. I think this is one of the things where parents find challenging, and as do practitioners, because you do have practitioners who query the diagnosis as well. That, you know, not all. I'll talk about that a little bit, about what level of nurse training nurses actually get on ADHD. Spoiler, it's not a lot, if anything at all, unless they work in a specialist ADHD service, and even then if they're lucky. But there is no known exact cause, in the same way that in the same way with depression or many of the other mental health psychiatric diagnoses, there is no what we call an etiological cause, and that's like that cancer is cancerous cells in the body, and we would call that cancer, and that is an etiological cause. Whereas with ADHD, we don't have that information. We know that things like low birth weight, smoking while pregnant, they can influence it. We know that there is a hereditary element, i.e., you see with Janine's family, there's a little bit of ADHD in that entire family. There's a 50% chance that one of my children will have ADHD. There's a 35% chance that one of my parents does. And I'm not going to say any more on that. But there's also, within that cause, as you said, environment is the key. And the biggest difficulty is that environments are not set up for people who are neurodiverse, who have neurodevelopmental differences, until they are. So Michael Phelps, very famous individual, athlete, Olympian with ADHD. Now, he's not disabled by ADHD in the swimming pool, but is he disabled by ADHD when he's doing his tax returns? Potentially. So the environment is different. Now, we know that school-based environments are not necessarily set up for neurodiverse kids. Some are better than others, but the idea of going and sitting down for, especially for teenagers, sitting down for a 2-hour lesson and then moving on to break and then going to another 2-hour lesson, I don't even do that as an adult. I move multiple times and stand up within every 1 hour period. So why do we expect that of our children?
But for the same reason that you were saying about nurses not getting training on ADHD, neither do teachers. Not generally speaking, only if they're lucky, or they've been some mandate to do so, or it's been somebody's interest within the school, so therefore they have pushed for it. It's the same, you know, and that's a lot of the reason. And I know when I delivered the ADHD training at the school I was most recently working at, people were like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And I was just given, it was a 45-minute session, and they were kind of shocked at what they were suddenly hearing, and it changed a lot of things. And so, yeah, believe me, teachers don't know either. They're doing the best with what they know, and they don't know, and they don't know that they don't know, so therefore they're not addressing the situation.
And that's what we find, is that the people who have strong opinions in this field often have the least informed opinions, I'm finding. Now, I'm more than happy to have discussions with people, but often for the teachers in the room, the word attachment comes up all of the time. Attachment, oh, it's attachment. It's early caregiver attachment difficulties, whereas actually Why not both? We know that ADHD makes it more challenging to attach to your child. We know that it makes it more challenging to be unconditionally loving to your child when they're essentially doing things that make you feel embarrassed, that when they don't sleep, when they act in ways that are different from other children. So you have to be a different type of parent yourself. You have to be a more proactive, a more informed, a more patient parent. And that's assuming you also don't have ADHD yourself,
Yeah.
of which there's a 35% likelihood.
So in these pictures are William and Rebecca. The one in the grass was at Hampton Court. You can see the shoes have been lost. There are some early signs of ADHD in the way they were, and they were climbing trees and all sorts of things that day. And it was an amazing day. And that was obviously before either of them were diagnosed, and they now are both diagnosed. So what will change from diagnosis? There's a picture on the left there. Will was diagnosed when he was in year 7, and Rebecca, I couldn't get Rebecca's Senko to acknowledge Rebecca's difficulties. So in the end, after a mental health crisis, we went private and got her assessed, and she was diagnosed. But in that picture there, Rebecca wasn't diagnosed. Now, what you can't tell is in that picture, Will was the self-assured young man who was diagnosed, knew why he struggled, was medicated, actually isn't now at 17, but at this stage in his life, he was medicated and he was doing fine. And her difficulties with mental health were just surfacing. She wasn't diagnosed. So one of the things that will change as a result of your children getting that diagnosis is that you are more able to equip them and to help them to equip themselves, and to get schools to equip them to have some resilience to protect their mental health. Rebecca, she's a very clever girl. She always managed to mask through primary school and pretty much into secondary school, and it's only as the curriculum got harder and harder and harder, the expectations from me as her parent and my husband and schooling in general to become more independent and to manage more things. If her executive function's off, if her ability to concentrate and to perceive time is off, it was just creating this massive amount of stress and anxiety, and she wasn't diagnosed, therefore she wasn't getting any support. And I knew, but I was being accused of pathologizing my daughter, so that kind of took a lot of my power away and made me doubt myself and everything else. But you know, we had some self-harm issues and things, and so one of the things that will change from you getting that diagnosis is that you can start to watch your child in a different way, pay attention to them, but help them to protect themselves from the battering that they will get for not remembering things, for being distracted, for things they do on impulse, the level of hyperactivity. Because do you know what? Having Tigger in your house is hard work. Having Tigger in your classroom is hard work. And as a teacher, well, you don't love the children the same as you love your own. I always love my students, but not the same as I love my own children. Managing Tigger in the classroom, Tigger is going to get shouted at, but do we want to change Tigger really? Or do we just want to give Tigger an education whilst allowing Tigger to be Tigger? You know, and it's all of those balancing things that we have to try to do with our children and make sure the education system does for our children as much as possible. It's hard. Their mental health will take a battering. And getting that diagnosis will help you, equip you, and make sure other people equip you and your children with what you need in order to protect their mental health.
Absolutely. I want to add on to that a little bit about mental health more generally, in that for the majority, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the room, but for the majority of individuals of all ages with ADHD, what I've found to be the biggest problem is not the ADHD symptomatology. It's not inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. It's the society's response to that, and the low self-esteem and the self-blame, the shame and the self-hatred at times that is the result of that discrimination. So I'd be very impressed if I could find an adult with ADHD who describes himself as having very strong, sturdy self-esteem, and that's never been an issue. Because actually, when you're told that you're different, when you're told that you are the problem, when you are told that it's not you I don't like, it's your behavior, but a child finds it difficult to disassociate their behavior from themselves, because what else are they? Their self-concept is not fully formed. So they live their life underachieving, often being different, finding things difficult, struggling with friendships, knowing that the teachers see them as a problem, knowing that the teachers see them as a management issue. And these are even for the best of the teachers as well. The resulting low self-esteem and the high amount of co-occurring or comorbid, depending on what language you want to use, anxiety and depression, they become the biggest issue. And to manage that anxiety, to manage that depression, the behaviors that are unhelpful, again, we talk about self-harm, we talk about risky behaviors, we talk about getting involved in the wrong crowd, we talk about going into drugs, getting a drink. Again, if I was in a terrible crowd in high school at one point. If you read my story as a child, I was set to go to prison at 16. My teachers informed me that I would be in prison by the time I was 16, if not 18, and would tell me this often. And people say, oh, that doesn't happen anymore. Well, as a nurse going into schools, it does. It absolutely does. It happens in every single school, in every single county, in everywhere in this country. And it happens in families. It happens with friends. And
I was told that about Will.
And this wonderful thing you said as well, you were tarred with, you are pathologizing your child. But the problem is, in the current system, you have to pathologize your child, because without a diagnosis, the chances of getting an AHCP or any form of statement or additional support in the school, depending on the school, can be lower. Some schools are brilliant and they do needs-led assessments. You don't need a diagnosis. They look at the child's needs. Others are less enlightened, shall we say.
I would say that we need to not be afraid of a diagnosis. And obviously there are issues with getting a diagnosis, but that is societal rather than actually a problem with a diagnosis. And a diagnosis, I will always say, is not a label. It is a recognition of a condition that a person has, and it points you in the direction of where you might go for support and strategies to support that child to their best possible outcomes. Do not be afraid of a diagnosis. You shouldn't be afraid or ashamed of a diagnosis, but of course people are, and it's easy for Tom and I to say, because no one says that we're lazy. No one's telling me that I'm a bad parent, because I've got those two are doing their A-levels. My eldest one has got autism and ADHD and some cognitive challenges, is living her best, is doing the best that she can do in a different situation. So she volunteers at a local charity shop 3 afternoons a week, and she does some work for me, and to be honest, that's her limit, and that's perfectly acceptable, isn't it? And we know this, but one of the first things we ask of people, we make this value call, oh, what do you do? No, I've got a profession. Tom's got a profession, so nobody's saying to us, you're just lazy, you're just using it as an excuse. So we are able to be open about it, and I think we both feel the imperative to do so. And of course, that's a lot of the reason that we are open about it and why we're doing this, because we feel that we can make a difference. And Will and Becca speak publicly about theirs, have spoken openly about their ADHD and their experience too. There's a Channel 5 video of Rebecca, and there's a video of Will when he was a bit younger talking about his experience in school that I'll share with Tom at some point, because I think actually you two have quite a good conversation. But yeah, what will change? Well, your child won't change. They will still be your child. They will still have ADHD. It isn't going to miraculously go away because you have a diagnosis, and it isn't miraculously going to go away if you are fortunate enough to try medication and have it work. It is going to remain. What will change actually probably is you and your approach to how you parent, in honesty. And that's what Tom and I are here for. I guide people on that all day, every day. It's what I do. And Celia too.
It's not just what is going to change, but also what should change, because you do have to parent differently. The the evidence is clear. It comes up in the research time and time again of parents of children with ADHD saying that they need to be more involved. Caregiving becomes a 24/7 event. It's no longer just what other parents experience. You have to be, as I said, more informed. The best, but once you have that diagnosis, that label, what it allows you to do is become educated. And I say this is, if a child was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis or with diabetes, even your child got diagnosed as diabetes, you're going to go to the team, the specialists. You're going to read books. You're going to understand now what your child can and can't eat. You're going to understand how to work out how best to care for your child. ADHD is no different. It's now, it gives us a frame of understanding. Oh, actually, the evidence says punishment is totally ineffectual. It doesn't work. I keep telling them, I take stuff off them and I'm punishing them and it's not working because it doesn't work for neurodiverse individuals. It's just less effective. It's very clear. The positive behavioral support movement of positively reinforcing desirable behavior and ignoring undesirable behavior has been found to be more effective at getting the expected and desired behavior change. Now, the average parent can punish, and yeah, it sometimes works. For our parents, it's less effective. It doesn't mean that you don't fall back to that when you're really annoyed and you're getting really cross and you're sick and you haven't slept for 5 days.
I think that's the thing as well with regards to, we are going to go on to talk about sort of like family members and friends and things, and people judging that, because they will look and they will think, well, you're not disciplining your child, you just let them get away with that. And it isn't that at all. It's actually that we've got to do it differently, but there's a judgment call made by other people and they don't know. And they don't know that they don't know. So don't be swayed by other people, be swayed by yourself. And what you are seeing with your child and what you are finding works with your child. You are going to have to do it differently.
You are. And you're also, spoilers as well, you're going to get it wrong.
Yeah.
And you're going to read things in a book and it's not going to work. And you're going to go, oh, does that mean he doesn't have ADHD? They don't have ADHD? No, it means that your child is an individual. You're going to look at the recommended books and you're going to use star charts and they're not going to work, or they'll work for a week. And now you've got to use a different reward system and a different reward system. And why do I have to keep changing? Well, you have to keep changing because your child gets bored.
But I still have that. So as I sit here in front of you now, I have a whiteboard up here that I use to plan my week or my day or whatever it is. And I have a physical planner just here for when that's not going to work for me, I can switch to this. And you know what? I also have the option of doing it electronically for when that won't work or when that won't work. I have to have 3 lots of things, and I do not know which one will work, because they actually, if something works for a week, it actually means it works. It just means it will work on rotation. It will work as one of the things that you try. So don't throw that idea out the window. If it worked for a week, that means it worked. It just means you keep that in sort of like a toolkit of things that you might pull out again in the future. Because if it worked for a week, it means it actually worked. But the nature of ADHD is that it won't work for long because it's not novel anymore.
If I was given a pound for every time a parent said, I've tried everything, I'd say, okay, try it again, but in a different order, at a different time.
Yeah.
Because sometimes your child is not ready for that strategy.
One as well. If the child's got the 3 options available, get into a discussion about which one is going to work. They want to try at this stage, and if it doesn't work, you say, okay, that one didn't work, which one are we going to try now? Oh, I've got a new one, let's try this one. You know, it's trying and reinventing constantly, but not thinking that if something stops working after a week, that means it doesn't work, because that means it does work. And
there's another thing in this as well about using strategies, and what I thought, and it links in with that idea of self-esteem and stigma, in that we say our child needs a reward chart, a marble jar, but he doesn't want to use it. And I go, oh, brilliant. Does mom have a rewards chart? Does mom have a marble jar? Does the brother or sister have a rewards chart and a marble jar? No, only one of them does. So that child, in a subtle, supportive way, is still being singled out. Actually, giving mom a marble jar and dad a marble jar allows the mimicking of effective behavior as in a same way, so that mom can say, oh, I did something nice for you and you didn't give me a marble. Do you think mom deserves a marble? And we're teaching the child about what is appropriate behavior, about kindness, about empathy. We're developing those social skills in a way which is just part of family life.
That's an interesting one, actually. I was just thinking of several examples of that. And I was being told that the children in my class last time I was teaching, because they were teenagers, they wouldn't use the thick triangular pencils. And I was like, well, they use them all the time. And they're like, how do you manage to get them using those? I'm like, because I use them myself. You know, and if I'm prepared to use the triangular pencils, the kids will it just becomes normal to use those. And so they did. So because they've got the sort of like the thicker grip, and most of mine had hypermobility and all sorts of things. So, you know, you're talking special school environment, and even though they're teenagers, so it's a bit of a different environment. But I led that change by doing the same thing myself. And yeah, it just, to me, it seems to make common sense. And actually, Tom, you made me realise something, and I hadn't really thought about it. Because Rebecca is doing her A-levels from home. But the skills that she needed to do that, of course, she's learned by watching me, hasn't she?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We mimic behavior in children, and the same thing comes when children have issues with violence and anger and aggression. And I say, okay, so how do mum and dad display when they are unhappy? Oh, well, we'll shout. Then why are you shocked that your child shouts? Because children learn, the social learning theory that we learn from the people closest around us, children most of all. And by changing our own behavior into that behavior we expect to see, you know, even more simply, oh, I want my child to learn piano. It's like, brilliant, do you play an instrument? No. Well, then the child is going to be the only one practicing every day.
Yeah.
But if a child sees a parent practicing the piano every day,
or doing homework,
or working, or reading. It was a wonderful study it was a while ago now, I think it was in Australia or America, where they found that for families with books in the household, the average education level of the child improved. So to fix this, the government sent a book to every single parent. And I'm like, that's not what was happening. The thing was that in family homes where there's books, parents are probably reading. And if parents are reading, the child is more likely to read. And if the child is more likely to read, then they're more likely to be academically attain. It's mimicking, it's learning what's appropriate. So when a child sees the parent talking about emotions or talking about feelings or expressing discomfort and expressing that they're unhappy with something in an effective way, the child can then learn those skills. And for the ADHD child, for the neurodiverse child, they need that more. They need it more often, more consistently, because they struggle with what's called generalizing. So it's understanding that I need to be kind at school, but I also need to be kind at home, and I also need to be kind at the pool. And it's generalizing across environments is sometimes challenging for anyone with ADHD or autism.
Do you want to comment on what we can expect from professionals from your point of view?
Right.
At point of diagnosis, what would be the information that you as a clinical professional would want to be relayed, or what do you think is best practice in terms of information and support that can be given at the point of diagnosis?
Okay, I'm going to be honest in that it is well regarded that there is not enough support post-diagnostic, if any. It's a postcode lottery, first and foremost. So depending on where you live, depends on whether or not you're even put forward for a parent course. Now, I want to focus on that language, parent course. You know, people go, I'm not going on a bloody parent course. I know how to parent. I've got 2 kids who are well adjusted. It's just this one. I go, but if your child had diabetes and there was a diabetes awareness course, you'd be straight on it. It's the same thing. These courses are not about teaching you how to parent. It should be about teaching you how to parent differently for the ADHD or autistic child with autism. It should be about the differences, how you need to do this.
They're not always framed that positively.
No, they're not.
That is specific to the condition your child got. but they're not framed positively, and there's sort of like a blaming and shaming that's associated with them. Parenting courses themselves actually don't improve ADHD. What they do improve is outcomes, because the parent can see through the ADHD to what the child needs and meet that need. Therefore, a child is less likely to develop secondary conditions such as conduct disorders. Oppositional defiance is ADHD plus environment, and therefore you're less likely to develop a secondary condition if parents have had the training that comes from, the support that comes from going on a parenting course, coming and spending this time on this sort of thing, which will open your eyes a little bit here and there, hopefully, and will just mean that you ask yourself a question rather than shouting at your child in that moment. Those are the sorts of things that make a huge difference over time, but they don't actually support the child's ADHD, because ADHD was never the parent's fault. Therefore, the parent being more equipped actually isn't going to resolve the ADHD. It will just improve your relationship with your child, which obviously is going to result in better outcomes.
And often the type of people who are delivering ADHD parent courses are me. I delivered it. I wrote and delivered one for the local area. But what also, in terms of expecting, what help should I expect from professionals? The unfortunate thing is, as we know, the NHS and child mental health is chronically underfunded to the point where it's crippled. The waiting lists, people are lucky to be on waiting lists for 18 months, which is appalling. Yeah. But that's the best that we can expect at this time in some places. Sometimes the NHS services are not commissioned to deliver post-diagnostic work. So they're literally not paid any money to do any additional work on ADHD. If there's a comorbid anxiety disorder, they can work around anxiety. But with relation to ADHD, it's an assessment service often. You get the assessment. In that post-diagnostic meeting, you have the opportunity to ask any questions, ask as many as you can, go prepared with questions, become the informed parent. That's the first step at that point. And then there's often a meeting, depending on where you live, about medication and the choice of medication. And sometimes that's it. And is it good enough? Absolutely not. Is it what we've got? Yeah. In some places, that's all we have. So it's about finding and seeking that support elsewhere. Sometimes the local authority, I know the local authority in Gateshead, I don't know if Anita is in the room, and her colleagues, they have a fantastic parent support group. There's an ADHD support group there. I know Bill in the audience somewhere, he runs an adult ADHD support group. It's find these support groups, become educated, come to these sort of webinars. If you have disagreements, give us some, let's have a conversation. My experience might be slightly different to other people's. I don't profess to be an oracle, but I know a couple of things. But read books on it, become that educated parent, because the reality is you're probably not going to have it given to you.
No.
In fact, you're definitely not going to. And that's a damn shame.
I mean, most of the ADHD professionals became so because they were having to find out what was what for their own children, and realised how important it was to do so, and then stepped up and into the realm of professionalism in this field, which is the case with me, and I'm betting I'm not the only one here. I think Celia would also say the same. Mm-hmm. So what to expect from, and there again Celia, agreeing with me there, what to expect from schools. That's hit and miss. Again, another postcode lottery, but that's sort of attitudinal as well as about sort of like resources and things. Because there is a moral and a legal expectation that we'll differentiate for our children when we're teachers, and we should put things in place. And when you've got a class of 30 odd, I don't know what's going to happen after lockdown, of course, but doing that can be really quite taxing and difficult, but then get some training in. That's what I do, and then I'm sure Tom would come along and do something.
I deliver ADHD training into schools as well, and it's often very much, the feedback's incredible often. People going, I didn't know that was ADHD. Yeah. I thought that was something else, which is... And it's not the teacher's fault, and I think we can very easily get into this narrative of blaming teachers. Now, sometimes teachers are just malicious. Yeah. There's no excuse for some of the things that are said to kids in this day and age. However, often it comes from a place of stress and a place of shame themselves, of feeling like they're struggling with these kids, and does that mean I'm a terrible teacher? Actually, no, it's the child's fault, and turning the locus of control back onto the child, as the child is the problem, not my approach. I can see that sometimes happening, but for good schools. Funny enough, my auntie's in the audience, and she runs a sort of forest school element in her school, and gets the kids outside, touching trees and running around, and lessons outside. And the evidence base for that sort of thing is really good as well. It's really strong. Change the environment, you change the outcome. But you've got to have teachers who are willing and on board. And as you say, that is a roll of the dice.
And they're so stressed.
Yeah.
No, I left teaching because, you know, it's really hard to make the difference that I went into teaching to make. And I know I'm not the only one. We could go on a soapbox about that. But you know, private options. So having instructing a coach to work with you or with your family or with your child, they're really good options actually. And can make a real difference. You to know that there's somebody that you can go to and say, oh my God, this happened, can be really quite empowering. And you know, even though I left with the intention of going only into training, that the coaching is just so important.
It is, as is,
and it's grown so much.
The practicalities of living with ADHD, the coaching on how would you resolve this? How would you make finances more interesting? Where do I put my keys? Well, my keys are down in exactly the same place every single day. If they're anywhere else, I've lost them and they might as well not exist. Now,
yeah, it's the same PE kits and homework and all of those things.
You know, the nice guidelines for adult ADHD as well. One of the nice guidelines is cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy is a mental health intervention, and the reason for it is not for the symptoms of ADHD. It's recommended for the co-occurring anxiety and low self-esteem and low levels depression that we often see that comes with being an adult with ADHD. So not only is there coaching and the practical support, I recommend therapeutic intervention very often, because you find that it's hard to develop and learn yourself as an adult or as a teenager or as a child when you're being hampered by these secondary conditions such as depression, anxiety, conduct difficulties, OCD, etc.
Both of my girls have had psychological interventions, counselling or similar, to come to terms with their differences and their experiences in life, and adjusting to being who they are and being okay with who they are. Will never wanted it, but it would have been available to him too. He seems to have just sort of fallen into his stride, but you know, never say never. It can happen.
Yeah. I think it's also worth bearing in mind, and whenever I deliver a lot of talks on ADHD in my journey, and I say that one of the most important thing, and she's again, this is representative of what I'm talking about. So my mom is in the audience right now. She showed up today to hear me talk because she supports me. And I'm doing a PhD. I'm literally a lecturer at my job, and yet she still wants to come along to see us and to show support. It's this unerring, unending, unconditional, positive regard. Both the ADHD Foundation conferences that I attended, Rory Bremner came out and he said, you know what you do with your child with ADHD? You love them. And that's it. You unconditionally love them, because no one else is going, no one else, but not many other people are going to, because they're going to face a lot of challenge. And having that unconditional, that's so your child knows that no matter what happens, no matter if they get one GCSE and become a bricklayer, or they work as, you know, people always say bin man, but I think, you know, it's quite a well-paid job, and it's quite anyway. Or they go to university, or they don't, or they get A levels, or they don't, or they get 5 GCSEs at A to C and have a 2.5 kids and a dog and a house. Like, regardless of what they have, they are okay. That was the narrative that was instilled in me, and I think was the thing that stopped me going to prison.
With Will, no matter, as you mentioned, no matter what, when he was in year 5, so this was like when things were really starting to be like, we've got this isn't just a phase, this is something else. I bought him a cuddly dog. It's quite a raggy dog, and I called it No Matter What, and I gave it to him, and I said, this is a hard time for us, we've got some things to get through, but we're on the same side, we're not on opposite sides, we're on the same side, so I'm giving you this, and his name is No Matter What, because I'm going to love you no matter what, and we're in this together no matter what. So he is now in year 12. It's still in his bed. His girlfriend's also in his bed. Not at the moment, obviously, we're in lockdown. But generally speaking, his girlfriend might be in his bed. But no matter what, in his bed. Too much information, sorry. You know, because they grow. And this is the message that he got. And I can't tell you how fundamental that was in the flip in his head, because he didn't take that for granted. He wasn't sure of that, actually. And we think our children know we're going to love them unconditionally. But actually, they don't necessarily go and tell them. Go and make a point of telling them that this is hard, but we are in this together no matter what. Go and tell them. And I say that as Will's mum, having had that experience. But, you know, as I've said right at the beginning, I ended up in care, and I'm not knocking my family. I understand why that happened, and it is what it is. And I have a close relationship with my mum now. My dad's no longer with us. But it's like, I didn't have that unconditional love. I still managed to provide that for my children. But for whatever reason, my son, he didn't really know that he had that until I actually went and told him. So you do go and tell your children that you've got them, no matter what.
There was an intervention I would recommend to every single parent, no matter what the problem was. And the ones who did it found a dramatic improvement, no matter what the problem was. And that intervention was special time. And what that was a bit of the day carved out every single day, even every couple of days, but a bit of time carved out for you and your child to spend together, no matter what, to listen and discuss emotions and experiences and checking in. And often, you know what, sometimes as they get older, the child no longer wants it and no longer comes to it, but it's still available. It's not, how are you doing, while you're on your phone. It's not, how, let's have a catch up while I'm making tea. It's unconditioned attention. And if they want to talk about Lego, talk about Lego. Yeah, if they want to talk about...
As tends to be mealtime as a family. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, well, and mealtime can be a really effective time for that. But I find that sometimes with multi-child families, it's about the individual time. So mealtime is a very important time for discussing family issues and being cohesive as a family. But there's also these moments of individual time. So I've worked with some fantastic clinicians who have children with ADHD, and they'll say, oh, this Saturday or this weekend, I'm taking out my daughter and we're going for a daddy-daughter time. And then next Saturday, I'm going out with my son and we're doing son-mom time, because actually the son doesn't want to be with the dad that weekend. And they're having individual time. And
hot chocolate was Will's thing. You know, he would either ask, I would make him, it started with me making him a hot chocolate when he was kind of just bubbling a little bit, and I started making him a hot chocolate and it became hot chocolate time. And then, of course, when he got older, he was just like, Mama making hot chocolate, which is code for I want your time, which is, you know, and even now he'll make hot chocolate and he's 17, nearly 18.
Yeah, again, I was 29 yesterday and I still talk to my mum on the phone once a week.
Happy birthday for yesterday, Tom.
Yeah, thank you very much. It feels no different to being 28, I'll be honest.
Should we talk about medication?
Should we talk about medication? What I don't want to do in this, because I'm mindful of time as well, is don't want to go through too much into how the medication works, what it does, what the mode of action is, how does it affect the brain. Suffice to say that ADHD medication, methylphenidate particularly, is one of the most researched medications of all medications. It has also been proven to be the most efficacious, the most effective at doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is actually only this much. It doesn't fix your child. It just improves concentration slightly and sometimes reduces impulsivity. gives them space. That's all it does, really. But it's also not always necessary. I'm unmedicated. I might talk about why shortly, but
I'm medicated. I
Yeah.
take medication.
So do you have to take medication?
And I think that it's important to be pro-choice, isn't it?
However, there is a lot of discussion and evidence that parents feel pushed into medicating their child when they do it against their wishes. That schools say things such as, well, if they're not taking medication, they're not going to achieve, because achievement is the most important thing for our children. We all know that, yeah. If they don't achieve, they're not worthy as human beings. That was facetious, by the way. Or the only thing offered by CAMS, SIPs is medication, so they feel like that you have to take whatever you can get. But it can have fundamentally amazing results. It can really turn, people say it's changed my child's life, it saved my child's life. They couldn't access school at all, and now they're going on to do a degree. Like, it can have that sort of impact, but it can also have almost very limited impact, or it can have some really challenging side effects. And parents, again, need to be aware and educated to be able to weigh up these options. How do you weigh these things up? No one can do that for you. What is not sleeping very well worth? Because that's one of the side effects. What is having poor appetite worth? What's the benefit? I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Janine.
I'm very pro-choice on medication. I think that there are benefits to it and there are drawbacks to it. Now, for me as a teacher, I struggle to teach without my medication. Therefore, I sort of feel that lots of children with ADHD would struggle to learn without their medication. And there's a lot of neural wiring and stuff that takes place, neuroplasticity. When we are learning, we build up our stamina for learning, which potentially means that it's taxing us less, therefore we maybe need meds less, but it's a whole thing on that. I think if your child, whatever decision you make, don't let it be based on the stigma. Let it be based on the facts. Let it be based on your experience with your child. No scaremongering from that person, no pressure from that person. You have got to become immune to all of that and look at your child and what your child needs. Vicky, when she had her first medication, that's the oldest one who's also got autism, she took her first tablet when she was 19 years old, and it was like turning a key in a lock. And I'm not kidding. She went from almost being chucked out of college for a second time to suddenly getting merits. And yeah, then I felt guilty as a parent for not having looked at it sooner. But do your best until you know better, and then do better. We are where we are. And then it was the same with Will from the first time he took medication. But that doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that it can't make children feel anxious, because it can. And it can change the way, it can change your relationship with food during the day. But you know what? You can actually push through the not feeling hungry at lunchtime. You believe me, I take medication and I definitely eat. I definitely manage to push through it. And do you know what? I also sleep. So there's like a level of sort of like being prepared to push through. And if a child is not managing to eat a proper lunch, that's fine, but give them something. And if they're always having something, eventually the stomach will remember and will develop that, and will expect that, and will therefore tell you you're hungry. So you can push through these things, and I'm not saying that's perfect. And of course, Will and Becca have just got ADHD, whereas Vicky has autism and ADHD. She's never been able to push through, but partly, I believe that that's because she associates the medication with not being able to eat. So you've got that on top of the fact that she doesn't feel hungry. We've never been able to push through that. So if she takes meds, she will not eat from breakfast and through till tea time. I haven't managed to do that because I don't live in this utopian world where my children do everything I ask them to, even when they're adults, especially when they're adults. But Will and Becca, they both eat in the middle of the day, as do I. We've all pushed through that and are able to eat in the middle of the day and sleep at night. But I would say I wouldn't want none of us would. None of us want children to be taking a single milligram more of anything than they need. It should always be, ADHD medication should always be you or your child on a good day. It shouldn't change them. It should just bring out the best in them. It should just make it possible for them to reach their potential, and that's it. No more. No more than that.
And what medication can be as well is it can be a tool to have a little bit of space to learn the skills that will go on into adulthood. So I use my excuse of being unmedicated and why I'm successful in the ADHD realm, if you want to use that, education, etc., is that my strategies are very good. And my mum, as I've said already, she was a mental health nurse, she was a psychiatric nurse. So she was able to utilize strategies that she knew were effective. Funnily enough, I've got report cards from the teachers saying, Mum thinks that a star chart might be a better idea than a report card. We are skeptical. Like, fantastic, you know. But medication will allow you or your child to learn the skills to be able to manage without it as well. So or alongside it, or manage more effectively. So to learn new skills is to have that bit of space. And it's funny you said something about eating there, Janina. I remember when I grew up, my mum would get slices of ham and fill them with peanut butter and pass them to me as I was running around the room or running around the garden or playing armies or something. Like, you've got to be curious, you've got to be creative, find ways to get food in, to get sleep in, to get activity in, especially in lockdown. We've had to be creative to find new ways of having interesting activity for kids. But yeah, so medication is potentially...
So you don't have to. Yeah, you don't have to. But if you choose not to, don't let it be because you're being influenced by stigma or pressure. Yeah. And if you do the same way, you must have a free and open mind to that, and be looking at your child and what's right for your child, regardless of the judgments of others and the pressure of others. You have to become immune to that. And your children need to see you becoming immune to that as well, because they're going to need to be immune to it too, aren't they? So if they see you pushing back and saying, well, they can think that all they like, but we do know better, don't we? That's kind of like how it goes through with them, and it builds up their resilience to that kind of judgment moving forward as well. Because lots of our kids get to teenage years and go, I don't want to take it. It's not the way it makes me feel. Yeah, because of course it's much more fun to be bouncing around the room than it is being able to sit down and watch other people bounce around the room.
Yeah, and as well, medication is not a yes or no question forever. It sometimes comes up in these discussions. It's like, you can try it for a bit and then stop and then come back to it 6 years later, or come back to it, oh, actually GCSEs are coming up, things are a lot harder, maybe we should give that another try. Okay, if GCSEs are over, now he's working, we don't need it anymore.
Brenda said, didn't he, that he takes them, he doesn't want to take them when he's doing his stand-up work.
No,
but he doesn't need them at that point.
Brain firing off on tangents, and he says it makes him less funny. But
yeah, but then for his tax return, he takes them.
Yeah, that's exactly what
and I think if you think about your children that way, it's like, well, of course they're going to want to be more funny, and therefore they're not going to want to take that medication.
Mm-hmm. Oh, have people lost Janine? Give us a nod if you... Right, I think we've lost Janine there. Well, she may or may not come back quickly. I'll just continue on a little bit there. Yeah, we have lost her. Okay, Silvia, you're all right? Just giving her a quick message.
Yeah, I've just messaged Janine, so she's... if you want to just carry on, Tom, I think the next slide is about how to support your child. Yeah. And we'll sort things out from our end.
Yeah, and then we've got the questions at the end. I knew we were going to go over time. So in terms of how do you support your child? Well, it's how do you skin a cat? There are so many options, and your child will be different to every other child, but there will also be similarities. So yes, with the diagnosis, we know your child will have difficulties with inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, but your child also might have some traits, some of the symptom type traits of autism They might be slightly dyslexic, but not fully regarding a diagnosis. And this is what we talk about when we talk about neurodiversity instead of neurodevelopmental disorder. So a neurodevelopmental disorder is when they fulfill the criteria for a diagnosis. But neurodiversity is looking at all of these sort of types of conditions and differences as a whole. So dyslexia, dyspraxia, developmental coordination delay, tics, Tourette's, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, all of these are neurodiverse differences. So your child, or anyone's child, will have a different, I call it a smattering or a jigsaw, a neurodiverse jigsaw of who they are, as we all do as humans. So what will work for one child may not work for others. But one thing we can do with that is we can start making decisions around what we know is likely to be effective. And we find that by becoming educated. It goes back to that over and over again, is becoming the educated parent, is reading about it, being creative, trying things out, trying things and having them fail spectacularly. So we know that the child is likely to have is more likely than the average child to have difficulties at school. So it's how can you support a child at school? Some of that is fighting for them tooth and nail, and getting what you need from schools and going in, and sometimes you've got to be the awkward parent, sometimes you've got to be the supportive parent, sometimes you've got to be the I actually do know more than you teacher's parent. Sometimes that's not a helpful place to be. I'm just saying, Janine, talking about like how you support your child and how we develop.
Yeah, can't go back to the slides.
Now, within that, depending on there's the battles at school, but also where there are really good relationships with school, we see more effective outcomes. We see better outcomes. So it's trying to maintain a good, positive relationship with the school as best you can, as teachers and as parents. In terms of home time, sometimes it's about making sure that your routines are tight and solid. You've got a morning routine that you found has worked for you. You've got a nighttime, bedtime routine that you know that works for you, and you try your best not to deviate from it. Again, I'm 29-year-old and I have the same nighttime routine now. And funnily enough, it involves 15 minutes of meditation every night in a bath, and reading every single night. And if I don't do any of those things, it feels wrong. You want to have your child to have that level of routine, because then they don't have to think about things. If you've already picked out the clothes the night before, you wake up in the morning, you don't have to use your executive functioning and fill your brain with decisions on what do I eat for breakfast and what do I wear. I know what I eat for breakfast. I eat the same thing every day. I know what the child knows how they're going to get to school. They know what they're going to eat. They know what they're going to wear. Non-school uniform days can become absolutely traumatic for some of our ADHD kids, because they now have to think about something they didn't have to think about before. So their ability to hold this information in the frontal lobe and their executive functioning is less than the average child. So they become overwhelmed more easily. So creating an environment to reduce that overwhelmedness, an environment, do you really need to snap at them because they're not using a knife and fork? I didn't learn how to use a knife till I was about 16. You know, you pick your battles. Some battles aren't worth fighting. And are the battles for you and your child, or are they so that because you're worried about how other people will see your child and your family? You know, why are we making these decisions? And this level of reflection, it's, you know, do all other parents have to think about it to this degree? Probably not. Is it fair? Probably not. Is it the reality of the situation? Yeah. And that's just how it has to be. So how do we know what to do? We don't. We try. No. We try different things. We find out what doesn't work. We read books and read articles and come to webinars and go, I'm going to try that marble jar idea, and I'm going to put my own marble jar there as well. And we'll see how that works. It might be terrible.
So a lot of that is about modelling the behaviour that you want your child to exhibit. So that's you as a role model. But I found it's really has worked a lot with, particularly with the younger lads that I've worked with, is Captain Underpants and Dogman. and knowing that Dav Pilkey, who wrote that, was it Dav Pilkey or Dav Pilkey, has ADHD, and there is a page in each of his books that says that bit about the author, that talks about him being the child that was always in the corridor because teacher used to say and told him he would never make a living out of his drawings and his writing of comic material. Clearly that teacher was wrong, and you know, it only takes one person, one adult, to believe in a child for them to develop some belief and faith in themselves. Let that be you, be that person.
Yeah.
In my talks, when I'm talking about my life story, I show a letter my parents got from my school saying that I had edited my report card. So there's not time to sort of like labour the point here, but usually I ask people to think about why I might have done that, why I might have changed a C to an A or whatever, and edited my report card so that it was better than it would have been otherwise. And people generally think it might have been because I felt like I deserved more, I didn't want to disappoint my parents, all sorts of other things, but actually it was because I did it on impulse. I impulsively, because someone said, oh, you could easily change that C to an A, all you've got to do is do that. So do you know what, before I even thought about it, on impulse I did that on 1, and then I did that on 2. By the 3rd one I'm regretting it, but I can't undo what I've done now, can I? And I had no safe adult that I could go to and say, I've made a mistake, please help me. So if I can say anything to you about being an adult in the life of a child with ADHD, is please be the safe adult they can come to and say, I have messed up. That you can help them to learn how to rewind out of situations, own what they've done, because there's consequences for actions, there's no excuse and everything else. All those things are very, very true. But there's a lot to be said for being able to teach a child how to rewind out of a situation, how to make it as good as it can be, to own it, to apologise for it, to accept the consequences, and to learn. I didn't have that adult, and there was nobody in my life who was being that difficult for me. Therefore, I was kind of stubborn, wasn't I? So I ask you, please be that adult that a child can come to and say, I have messed up, and you go, oh no. You know, obviously you can sort of say that was a stupid thing to do, but ultimately, ideally you wouldn't. Ideally you'd be more sympathetic than that. But, you know, there's consequences. It's like, well, you know, you're not going to get away with that, but let's make this as good as we can be. Please be that safe adult. It's really, really important in terms of the role model side of things. Yeah. Owning up to the things that go wrong is really important.
In line with that, in my talks, one of the things I talk about was a narrative that was given to me by a head teacher, and I've still got the report card and I use it in my talks, and it says, oh dear, ! Perhaps we are going to have to quell this streak of independence so that Tom isn't quite so noticeable. Now, I know it verbatim, and yet now I'm paid to be noticed. I'm paid to talk. My job is talking and being the center of attention. Like, your kids likes talking, put them in the debate club. Find them somewhere where we can turn that wildness into strength. I tapped too much, I was irritating and I would tap too much. What did my mum do? She bought us a drum kit. Now, not all parents can have that privilege, but I bought a drum kit and I learned how to play drums.
Mine was tap shoes.
Ballet, dancing,
you know, yeah, that was the thing for me.
Something. And it's about finding strength in the difficulty and finding a way to change the narrative, to flip that narrative. Your child is absolutely obsessed with Minecraft. Well, let's look at architecture. Let's look at how a building's made. Let's turn that into a learning opportunity. They're obsessed with Fortnite, less so. You're not going to have as many opportunities. But finding a way to turn those
challenges into
difficulties, in flipping them into a more positive narrative. And it can be done with most things. It can. It's just about being creative.
Because this is Tom and I, obviously we've spoken quite a lot about mental health. We understand the importance of that massively, and mental health comes before academic or other attainment. Being well mentally is the cornerstone of being developing into a well-rounded adult.
Yeah.
And the last one,
mindful of the time, and I know there's questions from the audience.
Okay.
I don't know how you want to do things.
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to just keep going. But I know not everyone
I
will
mean,
have
we
the
are
time.
recording it, so people need to go. If there will be a recording available, and I'll send that out on a link, but it will be on YouTube. With regards to drop the rope, I watch lots of parents getting into a tug of war with their children, especially when they've got oppositional children. Your role is not to be on the opposite side as your child. Your role is to be alongside them. And I know that's not ideal, and I know that that's me saying something, and actually, you know, in a perfect world, it would be different to that. But it is a question of getting on the same side as your child, just fighting for them and with them, so that no matter what principle, it's really, really important. And pick your battles, as Tom was saying earlier. It's really important to do that. Drop the rope. If you're in a tug of war with your child, drop the rope and join their team. We forget. And I think what happens when we join their team is they learn that that's what they need to do as well. We model the behaviour we want from them. They will come to us because we went to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Difficult family. We've kind of talked about this a little bit, haven't we, already?
We have, and I think, again, it's everything is going to come back really to that thing of you having to become the educated parent. Now, if a family member says, oh, well, it's not real, it doesn't exist, well, getting into a discussion of what does it mean to exist. Now, if they start saying like things like depression, mental illness doesn't exist, well, maybe that's an argument just not worth having. So for some people who are quagmired in their thinking and aren't willing to change, sometimes it's about, you know what, not engaging in that conversation and knowing that you're not going to go to that person for anything related to the difficulties that your child has or the differences that your child has. Sometimes that person is your own parent or your spouse, and that makes it really hard.
Or the ex-spouse.
Yeah, and there's no real correct answer there. There are some excellent things around like family therapy that can help to resolve communication difficulties in relationships, especially in the face of illness and diagnosis and conditions and difficulty. But when you come and you are informed and you're able to have an informed discussion about it, often I find people are willing to start changing their beliefs on, especially on ADHD. I love having discussions with people who say it doesn't exist, because I want to understand why they believe that, how they got to that decision, and what does that mean. And then you can start saying, well, actually, science has changed. And even if you don't believe it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, there is still evidence that a group of people who have these collective set of symptoms, whether you think it's attachment or space aliens, whatever you think it is, this group of people find these things hard. So change the environment for them. You don't have to convince everyone. You just need to make it so that your child's environment is conducive to their growth and their development. So
you don't need to own the criticisms and the judgments and the opinions of other people. They're entitled to them, but you're also entitled to say, okay, and go about your own thing, your own way, because you know, and you may not be able to change their minds. And that's actually okay. So you have to have that resilience, and it's not personal when they think they know, and they don't know. So they're not your best friend in that situation, but you can still love them, but you know, perhaps slightly bigger distance. Unfortunately, it can be really hard, that, and it can feel like a loss, but it's a gain in the long run, because if it wasn't that, it was something else. And you know, it's you don't have to own the judgment of others.
Mm-hmm.
What does the future hold? Whatever you want it to, because it is true that people with ADHD are more likely to have difficulties with getting on the wrong side of the justice system, substance abuse. You know, we are potentially at risk of lower outcomes and not reaching our potential. However, I hope that I've presented to you here some faces that might make you sort of think differently about that, because and the quote that I came across, and the link to that quote is just outside its side, so that I've got it there. There's 6 times more likely, adults with ADHD are 6 times more likely to start their own business. I think that's really, really important to notice. And you've got Tom there, You've got myself and Dr. Tony Lloyd. Dr. Tony Lloyd runs ADHD, he's the CEO of ADHD Foundation, and he is increasingly open about the fact that he also has ADHD. And yeah, he's amazing. And you've got Celia, who you've met briefly. Then you've got Sarah, who runs Operation Diversity. So she's an entrepreneur and another professional committed to the cause of improving outcomes for children and young people. And then you have my stepson, Mitchell, who was diagnosed with ADHD, having gone to one of my talks, and he was just like, oh my gosh. And then he went and got a private diagnosis and stuff. But he runs his own PT company, and he's just completed his first degree, and he's just signed up for teacher training. He's amazing. And you've got Simone Biles, then you've got Rory Bremner, Michael Phelps. Look at all those medals, because you know what, when he was swimming that much, he didn't need his ADHD meds. When he had a break,
yeah, he started taking them again. Yeah. It looks like have we lost her again? Nodding.
I think so.
I did a section in the talk at the ADHD Foundation conference on role models and celebrities with ADHD. Now, people like will.i.am, he talks about his self-expression and his creativity coming from the fact that he's neurodiverse, but he also had some unhelpful comments to say about medication. Just because he decides not to use it, it's knowing that these celebrities and these incredible sportsmen can be role models, but they're also not experts in this field either. Sometimes, and sometimes they're
no. And you know what? If you've got an entourage, do you need medication? You're not running your own life that way, is it? I mean, you know, do you know what? If I had an entourage, I probably wouldn't need to take meds. Just saying.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, so it's
but,
also,
you know, we still give decent role model.
Who we're listening to,
yes,
and what they're saying. And with that, I imagine there's...
So that's me and how to contact me. And that's Tom and how to contact Tom. And you can contact Celia through me if you want to. And any questions? Over to you, Celia.
We've got some questions. You've got some really, really lovely questions. And a lot of what you've said has really resonated with people, which is really, really lovely. We've got a quick question about, Tom, you've been talking about medication, Tom and Janine. Have you got any thoughts about people who feel that they want to use medication sometimes, but not all the time? Have you got any views on that? I know you talked about that you might need medication for a time when you're coming up to exam or something like that, and then feel that you might not need it. But there was just a question about, you know, would it work to have medication a few days a week, not every day, and just whether you've got any thoughts on that?
It depends on the medication slightly. So for instance, a medication like atomoxetine needs to have what's called a therapeutic dose in the blood. So atomoxetine is a medication that needs to be taken every single day with no pauses. However, the more common medications, the stimulant medications such as methylphenidate, dexamphetamine, so you might hear Ritalin, Concerta, Medicanet. They have various half-lives of a number of hours, 6, 12, 24. And absolutely, obviously in line with your doctor. So don't take my word for it. Don't take Janine's word. Don't take any of our words for it. We're not your doctors. We don't know your full course. We don't know your child's physical health needs. We don't know your case. But there are parents who utilize medication as and when. They take breaks on the weekend, because why would you need it? Some parents actually, they really need that medication at home because the impairment is so much and it's so challenging that their child is unsafe at times without having a therapeutic dose a large amount of the time. It's a case-by-case basis. You know, having long breaks from it, the summer holidays is very common. To use it when you need it is what a lot of adults do. But you need to be aware that you're being appropriately monitored by the CAM service, and that is a shared decision with your doctor. I would always advise that. Don't just start going, well, I'll have a little bit now and a little bit then. Make sure you've discussed it first.
So you discuss the regime you're thinking of before you go on to it. Yeah.
a cautionary tale on that, because I worked with a young man who didn't take his on the weekend, and what happened was he would have impulsive behaviours at the weekend that were getting him into trouble, into mortal danger. And then he would go into a depressive cycle. So actually, in terms of his mental health, he needed the medication at the weekends to stop the negative behaviour happening that then made him hate himself and put him back into that cycle. And as much as he hated having to take them on the weekend, he had to. So because otherwise he was a danger to himself and others, because of the level of impulsivity that he had. So as much as I, for myself and for my children, have a flexible regime, and I promote that as much as possible, it's not a universal truth that will work with everybody. So you do really have to have the team around the child paying attention to what's going on there, and risk assess it, because it can be really problematic.
Pretty much echoing what I was saying. It can be done, but it shouldn't just be one decision.
Make sure you've got the help from the psychiatrist or doctor. And just had a very quick question just come in. Could you just flip back in the slides to your contact details? A couple of people were just wanting to note them down, and then let them, while we're talking, they can be doing that. And then one of the questions we had was, what to do, because sometimes assessments take a really long time. We've got somebody who said to me that they've been waiting over 6 months already, and they're finding that really at school, in the meantime, their child is just not learning as much as they would like them to. Are there things that you would suggest to talk to school about even before the diagnosis that would help with a child who's not getting very much out of their schoolwork? I mean, are there classic things like movement breaks, or other things that you think the parents could suggest to school, or resources that they could perhaps print out and take into school with some ideas? I don't know what you think.
Do you want to go, Janine?
Well, in terms of classroom strategies, there's lots of things that can be tried, and there is no universal right way to do things. So you have to kind of go with the individual. But if you've got a child who is using going to the toilet as an excuse to take a break in the middle of a lesson, that suggests they need a movement break, and that's a socially acceptable way to ask for it. So then as a teacher, it's a question of putting something in place that allows them to get up and move, that's socially acceptable, and the teacher knows why they're doing it and isn't agitated by it, doesn't draw attention to it. These are also the children that over sharpen pencils, are rocking on chairs and that sort of thing. I would suggest fiddle toys that are not of the sort of like high you don't want fidget spinners, and you don't want things that click, because those are the sorts of things that are going to make it impossible for everybody else around that child to concentrate, and also it can actually absorb their concentration. What you want is something for them to be able to just have something tactile. So a little bit of blue tack. This is my desk, of course, therefore there is blue tack. Or I've got like curly bands, like you get for like hair bands that have got the spiral ones. They're great because you can just literally move them through your fingers, and they just create some sort of simulation. Tom's just got out his fidget cube. And they can be used. It depends on the child though, because something like that can be disruptive, or it can be really, really workable. So again, you have to go with the child. But as I say, with those spiral bands, teachers would say to me, yeah, but they're just going to ping them. And I'm like, well, if they ping them, they were going to do something else. So then pinging that is actually not so bad. And you know what? If your default position with the child is approval, it doesn't take much to pick it up, give it back to them, and shake your head at them, show your disapproval. For me, that's always been the things that worked, is that because my automatic thing with them, I'm glad that they're there, I'm enjoying their company, I'm enjoying teaching them. So my disapproval has always worked really, really well. Just that disapproving sort of like shake of the head as I hand it back to them and say that's not what it's for. But they need to be things they can put down again once it's time to write, or whatever. And I think that can be problematic, because then you've got these things laying around the place, and of course we just lose everything. But you can have stretchy bands around the front of chair legs for the child to push their foot back into. That creates a nice little way of letting some of the excess energy go. Oh my goodness, there's so many things I could say. That's a whole other webinar, really.
It is.
So that's kind of like a few things, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I was going to say, ultimately, a lot of these things are around sensory needs to help to assist in learning. So again, I've been sitting rocking the entire time while we've been talking. It's about having an understanding of your child's sensory needs and their sensory profile. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about there, again, that's kind of another webinar, but have a look into sensory boxes, finding ways to get that sensory stimulus that the child is requiring in a way that is more helpful. So again, for Blue Tack, we're getting that proprioceptive input that's really helpful to make a child feel a bit safe. That's why you see some children will rock, some will tiptoe walk. It's about finding that in an effective way, again, through trial and error. Do they love the smell of lavender? Can you have a small lavender smelling thing in a pocket to help relax them and see situations of stress? Or would lavender be the worst thing you could give them and they're going to go right up a height? You know that, you find that out. So it's doing like a sensory profile yourself.
Yeah, facilitating movement and addressing sensory needs, because they are needs. We need to move to learn, and we need proprioception. Yeah, proprioceptive input. So yeah, we need these things. They're not a want, they're a need.
And what would you say, sorry, I was just going to say this particular child is actually really struggling to just get focused on their work and stay concentrating. Their mind's really wandering. I mean, is there anything, I mean, before an assessment, obviously you don't have the help of potentially being able to consider medication.
But there's also a learning need there. You know, this is why a full multidisciplinary neurodevelopmental, but also a full assessment needs to be done, because sometimes children are inattentive because the work is unnecessarily or under or over challenging. Mm-hmm. So at school, I would refuse to do my work because I would say it was boring. You know, I can do it. What's the point? Whereas for other children, it might be that they actually find it really hard to access the work, maybe because of the way it's formatted, maybe because of the way it's worded, maybe they're more of a visual learner, maybe they need to get outside next to a tree and count branches instead of counting words on a page. But you need that full sort of educational assessment. Now that will not be given by CAMS often, it's the educational psychologist. So can you work with your school to look at potential educational psychology input? Because that's a learning issue, not a mental health issue.
Or specialist teacher.
Yeah, and especially in the SEND teacher as well, because people equate CAMS with all issues around ADHD. CAMS is a mental health organization, it's the mental health aspect of healthcare. It is not about learning. And that's sometimes really hard to differentiate, is that for support around learning, that should come from school.
It sounds like that child might have some anxiety around learning and has a very narrow zone of proximal development. So the bit between what's boring and what's too much can be incredibly narrow with our children. So really that's about the teacher having the skills and experience and wherewithal to hit it just right for that child. And consistently do that, because if that's not consistently happening for the child, the anxiety therefore rises, and that's when you kind of like get the secondary conditions and the oppositional, and if they're more on the ASD, they can become pathologically demanding of these things as well. So we have to go very carefully with that sort of thing, but that is what teachers should be able to do, is differentiate for that child, to know where that child's level is, and also to know that it can change from 1 week to the next week. Just because they could do it yesterday doesn't mean they're going to be able to do it today. So some anxiety going on there, I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. I think that's been really helpful. That's great, thank you. And then another question that we have, and then I don't have any others at the moment. So if anyone is on the chat and hasn't asked a question, or you feel you haven't got it answered properly, then this is your chance to give us your last question. But the next question I had was, what are the main challenges that you see with children with ADHD that they would take on into adulthood? So we talked about how some things can improve maybe with medication or strategies in terms of, you know, being able to learn, building up resilience to learning and doing all of that. But what would you say are the top things as young people that you would see going into adulthood?
Self-esteem.
Okay.
Number one for me. Self-esteem. Realizing that that your friends are going off to university and you're still struggling. Maybe you've been backgrouped. Realizing that friends aren't having the difficulties in relationships and friendships that maybe you have.
Yeah.
Realizing that being the funny, clown, jokey, loud, verbose individual at school was very, very fun and exciting for everyone else. But they stop caring as much when you're in your 20s. It becomes less funny, or the environment starts changing. People start being more serious. Those sort of things are definitely play that role in self-esteem.
Belonging.
And feeling belonging, feeling like you
Belonging.
are a part of something else. Right, so again, relationship difficulties. There is a vast amount of evidence about relationship difficulties for adults with ADHD, often because of differences in communication. Being inattentive displays to the other person that you don't care about what they have to say. Sometimes, at least that's how it can be perceived if they don't have the understanding. I'm very fortunate. My wife is a mental health nurse as well. You know, we have that level of patience and understanding. Now, not everyone gets that. Should be downstairs cringing right now, but not everyone has that opportunity or that understanding or that emotional tolerance as well. So there's suddenly these difficulties around relationships, around your job, around holding down a job. Forgetting a hand in your homework's one thing. Forgetting to do your taxes, forgetting to pay the bills is a very different thing.
Yeah.
The consequences go up.
Yeah.
That becomes much less fun.
And the
very
shame
quickly.
of that.
Yeah, it becomes when you
lots
are
of shame.
repossessed, when you're losing your house, when you are piled with debt, that becomes less funny than being the jokey kid at school. I wrote a paper on this, and it was on the outcomes of untreated ADHD in adulthood, about how people don't get the appropriate support, medication or otherwise, and it's damning. It's awful. The prison statistics are through the roof. The suicide statistics are higher. So it's making sure we get those supports in early and effectively is the key. You don't want to get to adulthood and suddenly have to start learning a lot of skills.
Yeah. Oh, we've immediately had a question, Tom. How do we access that paper?
Self-plug. What am I doing? Tell you what.
Can you circulate a
I'm not
link?
allowed to actually just like disseminate it, because normally you need it's on the British Journal of Mental Health Nursing, but I'll see if I'm allowed to legally to just disseminate it and send it to everyone, and you can send it to anyone who asks. I need to double check that, but I'm pretty sure you own the rights.
Well,
They add the link to it and choose to access it themselves, or if they've got academic access, then fine. If they haven't, then there's only so much you can do about that, isn't there?
Yeah, it was.
That's great. And then we've just, I think, got our final question, unless there's anything else that you guys wanted to cover, and that was we've got a question about a situation where there have been diagnoses of ADHD and sensory processing, but school is saying that everything is fine at school and there isn't an issue. And so for the parent, what would you say in that situation? How, obviously no one wants to fall out with schools when there is a difference of opinion like that, but are there top tips that you'd give for how to sort of convince them to
not a difference of opinion, is it?
It's not a difference of opinion at all. The school is wrong.
The school's in the wrong. There's no difference of opinion.
I know, it's just that obviously as a parent you don't, I mean, I know you said, Tom, sometimes you have to be a bit, go in and sort of, make a bit of a nuisance of yourself.
Yeah.
But it's a shame for parents to have to always pay for things privately. So should parents go directly to the Ed Psych service in their area?
Well, okay, I'll be more hesitant because that was an impulsive answer. It also might be true. Okay, so actually the school may not see much of the difficulty because the child may be able to manage effectively, and the child may be able to contain themselves in the environment amongst their peers, to reduce the shame and to stop feeling different, and they hold it in. So actually sometimes that does happen where the school does not see what the family and the clinic see, but the child gets home and unleashes because of the sheer effort, the force of will of trying to act normal all day. So no, the school is not wrong. However, if there is a diagnosis, there's a medical diagnosis.
Yeah, that's my point.
That has been given by a professional multidisciplinary team, there should be a report, and in that report should outline what that child needs so as to be appropriately supported in all environments.
Yeah.
The school then has a responsibility to fulfill those needs.
Yeah.
And it's finding that line of...
I may have misunderstood the question then.
It's assessed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I may have misunderstood the question. Because if there was a diagnosis, it isn't, you know, as a teacher, I got things through and sometimes I went, really? That's not how I see it. But ultimately, that wasn't my place in that situation, was it? My place, if there is a diagnosis, is to say, okay, and to challenge myself to think more broadly about that child, and to look for things that I might not have noticed before. You know, I've watched children, and everybody else, no, he doesn't have ADHD, no, he doesn't have ADHD. And I'm like, I'm watching him exhaust himself to try to comply. And then he goes out onto the playground and behaves like an absolute loon because he needs to, that he just explodes because he's held it in for the morning session up until break time and then goes and explodes. But he was diagnosed, but and I could see it, but nobody else around me could. So it's like, if it's been diagnosed, as teachers, you're not really, unless you've got a really good reason, and I mean a really good reason. You know, ADHD is difficult to diagnose. Children don't get a diagnosis of ADHD unless they've got it. I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, we should be trusting it if the child has a diagnosis of ADHD or sensory processing or autism or anything else. Yeah.
And often, as I said, when I go in and do training on ADHD in schools, they go, oh, that's ADHD as well. If we look about like inattentive type or the inattentive subtype or different combined types, like it's not that simple. And it's about people knowing who to trust and who to pay attention to. You know, there should be, nowadays there is a full team around every diagnosis. It's not just a pediatrician making a decision based on one clinic appointment anymore. That may have been the case many years ago, but that now there should be a school assessment, a school observation, a developmental history, in clinic, home visits, CONAS forms if they're using them in your area. It should be a real thorough assessment.
Yeah.
So, and I did hear that, I don't believe he's got ADHD, whereas me and the other clinicians are going, it's the most obvious case we've seen. It's just not, just because they don't have poor behavior, they're not a management problem, so they don't have ADHD, and it's finding that balance. What are the symptoms newly informed?
We could go on about that one.
I think, Annie, it's the sensory needs are often, because they're not part of the diagnostic criteria, but they're seen within 65 to 75% of people with ADHD, some form of sensory need. Mm-hmm. So when I say why they're slamming doors and why they're stamping their feet, it's not just because they're angry, it's because they're trying to fulfill an unmet need, a sensory need of feeling unsafe. And
we are saying need, not want.
Yeah, so give them that need in a safe environment. Yeah, but again, that's another topic.
Yeah. So I think we're going to need to close it there because we've run a bit over time. Thank you both so much. That's been really helpful. We've had some lovely feedback that's really hit the spot and given some great ideas to people today, and that's just been really helpful. So thank you very much. The contact details are there have been there for those of you who want to reach out to Tom or Janine. So please do. And then the video will go onto the ADHD Wise YouTube channel. So subscribe and do feel free to get in touch with Janine, Tom or I. You can reach ADHD Wise on Facebook and social media, and then there's a website. So get in touch if you've got any other questions or we can help. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you
for the conversation, Janine. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, and you, Tom, as always. And I'm sure we'll do more of this.
Yeah, we'll get on to something else next time.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Everyone. See you later.